The pine hollow was still breathing smoke when Ranger Caleb Rowe heard the sound. It was not a cry exactly. The fire had left too many noises behind for any one sound to be trusted. Blackened limbs ticked in the gray distance. Water from the last hose line dripped from a split branch. Ash slid off needles in soft, tired whispers. But beneath all of that came one small rasp of breath that did not belong to the trees. Caleb stopped with one boot half sunk in warm soot. The wildfire had crossed Split Creek Ridge 2 nights earlier, running fast through the late summer timber, turning the old ponderosas into dark posts against a copper sky. By morning, the flames had been pushed back, but the forest looked as if it had forgotten how to stand. He should have kept moving. There were hazard trees to mark, hot spots to check, a crew waiting farther down the drainage. But that faint sound came again, thin and guarded, not pleading, not tame, simply alive. Caleb lowered his radio. "Easy," he whispered, though he did not yet know who he was speaking to. He was 46 that summer, with gray beginning at his temples and a careful way of walking that made younger firefighters think he was calm by nature. Caleb had learned, over years of storms, missing hikers, injured deer, and one empty cabin at Split Creek Station, that panic rarely saved anything. A soft wind turned the ash at his feet, curling it around his boots like river fog. For gentle hearts staying with this story, a quiet like or subscription helped the channel, and the little community here loved hearing where viewers were watching from and what animal had once marked their lives. Caleb stepped around a fallen pine whose bark had been peeled by heat into long black ribbons. Near the center of the hollow, a root shelf had collapsed into a half-moon cave. That was where the breathing came from. He crouched and angled his flashlight into the dark pocket beneath the roots. At first he saw only soot. Then the soot blinked. 2 amber eyes opened from the shadow, hard and bright and terribly tired. Caleb held still. A bobcat crouched inside the hollow, pressed so tightly beneath the root shelf that her spotted sides barely moved. She was young, not a kitten, not fully heavy with adult muscle either. Her tufted ears were flattened. The left one carried a clean little notch near the tip, as if life had already taken a small signature from her. Her muzzle was pale. They kept te hot ash, and one front paw was tucked up beneath her chest in a way that told Caleb not to like what he saw. She did not snarl. That was what made him uneasy. A healthy bobcat cornered under roots would have given him teeth, a spit, a flash of claws like curved thorns. This one only watched. Her pupils narrowed and widened as smoke passed between them. A burr clung to one whisker. When Caleb shifted the flashlight away from her eyes, she pushed her nose toward the cooler dirt and inhaled once, slow and shallow. "Not here," Caleb murmured. "You don't have to stay here." She answered by turning her face slightly aside, not in trust, but in refusal to spend what little strength she had on him. That small, stubborn motion touched him more than any cry would have. Wild animals, he knew, did not surrender easily. They hid pain inside silence. They measured danger in footsteps, in scent, in whether a man leaned too close. This bobcat had survived fire by folding herself into the last pocket of earth that would hold her. Caleb thought of the old lantern hanging by his cabin door, the one his wife, Elise, used to light when he came home late from winter patrol. 3 years after she was gone, he still left it there, polished but unlit, as if the house needed to remember how welcome looked. Crouched there in the smoke, he felt the familiar hollow place inside his ribs answer the hollow under the roots. His radio crackled against his shoulder. "Roe, you clear up there?" Caleb pressed the button without taking his eyes off the Bobcat. Found a live animal in the burn pocket. Bobcat. Possible injury. Met holding position. There was a pause. Then his crew chief answered, softer. Copy. Need wildlife? Yeah, Caleb said. Get doctor. Voss on the line. The Bobcat's ears twitched at the radio static. She Dayrova kept back half an in, then stopped as if even retreat had a price. Her short soot-darkened tail flicked once against the dirt. Not wild panic, irritation. Even half-trapped in smoke dulled. She had kept enough spirit to be offended by his equipment. A tired smile pulled at one corner of his mouth. All right, he whispered. Mort don't like the radio either. Somewhere above them, a pine cone loosened in the heat and dropped with a small wooden knock. The Bobcat flinched, then fixed him with a stare so sharp, he almost apologized to her for the tree. Caleb set his pack down with exaggerated care. From an outer pocket, he took a foil emergency blanket, a bottle of water, and the small blue cloth he used for wiping soot from his glasses. He laid them where she could see them, because sudden hands were a language every wild thing feared. A strand of smoke drifted between them. The Bobcat lowered her chin onto her uninjured paw. The burr on her whisker trembled each time she breathed. She looked less like something rescued than something waiting to decide whether rescue was another kind of danger. Caleb settled back on his heels, giving her 3 feet of space that felt enormous, and not nearly enough. Ash dotted his knuckles like gray freckles. In the silence, he heard water dripping, his own breath, and the hidden little scrape of her claws against packed earth. Would he rush? Would he grab? Would he mistake fear for permission? Caleb did none of those things. He stayed crouched in the burned hollow while the light thinned over Split Creek Ridge and the first evening coolness crept beneath the smoke. When Dr. Mara Voss finally called through, he answered in a voice so low, the crew later teased him for it, though not unkindly. She's alive, he said. The Bobcat blinked once from under the root shelf. Caleb's whisper became smaller. And she's listening. Before the fire had found Split Creek Ridge, Caleb Roas' life had moved in small, deliberate circles. He woke before first light in the ranger cabin with the same old alarm that clicked more than rang, then lay still for a moment while the dark held its breath around him. The cabin had 2 rooms, a narrow porch, a sagging screen door, and a tin roof that announced every acorn, raindrop, and wandering squirrel as if each had come to deliver news. In late summer, the boards smelled of warm dust, pine pitch, and the faint black coffee he brewed too strong, because no one was there to complain about it anymore. He drank from a chipped green mug with a crack near the handle. Elise had bought it from a roadside potter on their 10th anniversary, laughing because the glaze had pooled unevenly at the bottom and made the whole thing look slightly seasick. Caleb had nearly dropped it twice in the years since she died, and both times he had caught it against his chest with an urgency that would have made her smile. Most mornings, he still set a second spoon beside the stove. He knew he did it. He also knew he would pick it up before leaving, rinse it though it was clean, and place it back in the drawer. Grief had become less like a storm by then and more like a habit his hands had not fully unlearned. Split Creek Station sat where the foothills rose into national forest, far enough from town that headlights on the access road felt like an event. Caleb's job changed with the season. In summer, he watched weather, fire danger, careless campfires, and wind through dry crowns. In autumn, he posted hunting boundaries and helped lost visitors find the road. In winter, he made sure the old radio tower stayed alive through storms. He had once loved the loneliness because it was shared. Elise had been a school librarian in town, but on weekends, she came up with paperbacks, soup in glass jars, and bright scarves that snagged on everything. She had placed a brass lantern on the porch hook during their first year there, claiming every station needed a friendly light. When Caleb came back late from patrol, he could see that lantern from the bend in the road, glowing through snow, or rain, or the dusty blue of summer dusk. After the illness took her, he left it hanging. For a long while he could not bear to light it. His neighbors understood in the quiet mountain way. Old Mrs. Bell from the mail route left peach cobbler on the porch without knocking. A seasonal firefighter named Tomas fixed the loose porch step and pretended he had only stopped by to borrow a wrench. Dr. Mara Voss, the wildlife veterinarian who covered 3 counties and never seemed to sleep, brought him a sack of dog-eared field guides from Elise's library, saying they needed a home that knew their pages. Caleb thanked them all. Then he went back inside. The forest, at least, did not ask him how he was. It only presented itself honestly. A fox crossing the road at dawn with a vole in its mouth. A raven dropping pine cones on the roof as if trying to improve the percussion. A black bear rubbing one shoulder against the trail sign until the post leaned like a tired man. He found comfort in creatures that came and went without promising anything. Bobcats were among the rarest to see. They were more often suggested than shown. A neat oval track in dust, a scrape beneath a juniper, the feathered remains of a grouse tucked under brush, 2 yellow eyes caught for a heartbeat at the edge of the road. Caleb respected them for that. They belonged to silence. They kept their own maps, crossed human trails only when it suited them, and vanished before a person could turn wonder into ownership. Once, near Blue Ledge, he had watched a bobcat sit on a sun-warmed rock and wash one paw with the offended patience of royalty. The animal had looked directly at his truck, yawned as if the entire Forest Service had bored it, and stepped into the manzanita without breaking a twig. Caleb had laughed for the first time in weeks. He told Elise about it that evening before remembering, halfway through the sentence, that the cabin was empty. That was how his days had been before the ridge burned. Work, silence, the green mug, the unused lantern. A life not ruined exactly, but narrowed. He fed himself. He did his rounds. He kept the cabin swept, sharpened tools, wrote reports in tidy block letters, and mended the same cuff of his work shirt 3 times because replacing it felt wasteful. Sometimes he spoke aloud to the kettle when it shrieked too long. Sometimes he told the porch step to behave after it groaned under his boot. Small warmth found him in foolish places. A ground squirrel scolding his truck tire. Mara asked terrible instant cocoa hidden in his cupboard, a row of muddy raccoon prints across a freshly cleaned inspection form. He had learned not to expect wild things to stay. Maybe that was why he was careful with them. Maybe that was why, when people brought him injured birds in shoeboxes, or asked whether they could keep a fawn curled by their fence, he always spoke gently but firmly. Help was not the same as keeping. Kindness sometimes meant backing away. Love, he had discovered the hardest way, could not always be measured by nearness. The day before the fire, Caleb had stood on the porch and watched thunderheads build beyond the western ridge. The air had been hot and metallic. Pine needles hung motionless. Even the jays had gone quiet, which made the whole forest feel as if it were listening under a closed door. He had touched the cold lantern with 2 fingers. "Not tonight," he had said softly. Then lightning came without rain. By dawn, smoke had laid itself low in the drainage, and Caleb had been called out before his coffee cooled. He had not known, as he locked the cabin behind him, that somewhere above Split Creek, a young bobcat with a notched ear was already running through the underbrush, choosing shadow after shadow, carrying fear in her lungs and wildness in every silent step. He had not known she would bring sound back into his empty life. Not loudly. Only with one rasping breath beneath burned roots. By the time Caleb returned to the burned hollow in memory, the light always came back the same way. Low, copper-colored, strained through smoke until the whole ridge seemed to be looking through tired eyes. He had been kneeling beside the blackened roots for nearly 20 minutes when Dr. Mara Voss arrived on the upper trail with a canvas medical bag bumping against her hip and ash already dusting the brim of her hat. She was 52, narrow-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and gentle only in the ways that mattered. Animals trusted her slowly. People usually trusted her at once. She stopped several paces behind Caleb and did not come closer. That was why he had called her. "Where is she?" Mara asked. Caleb lifted one hand, palm low, under the root shelf. Mara crouched without stepping forward, squinting through the smoke. The bobcat's eyes flashed once from the dark, then vanished behind a curtain of singed fern. A faint hiss came from the hollow. It had very little force behind it, but the meaning was plain. Mara nodded as if the bobcat had introduced herself. "Well," she murmured, "she still has opinions." Caleb felt the smallest looseness in his chest. That S something. It's a good something. A hot spot somewhere deeper in the stump gave a quiet pop. Caleb smelled wet ash, scorched sap, and the bitter edge of burned pine needles. The scent clung to his tongue. All around them, the trees stood silent and dark, their trunks striped where the fire had climbed and fallen away. A jay called once from beyond the burn line, then thought better of it. The bobcat shifted under the roots. Caleb saw the movement of her notched ear first, then her face edged into the beam of his flashlight. She had triangular cheek ruffs clumped with soot, white fur under her chin, and faint spots along her shoulder beneath the gray dust. Her left forepaw remained tucked high, not dangling, not useless but guarded. When Mara opened her bag and the metal latch clicked, the bobcat pulled her lips back just enough to show the tips of her teeth. "Sorry," Mara said softly, as if speaking to a person sleeping in the next room. The apology made Caleb glance at her. Mara caught it and shrugged. Manners cost nothing. The bobcat's whiskers trembled. The burr caught on one of them, wobbled like a tiny, ridiculous flag. For one strange second, with the whole ridge burned hollow around them, Caleb had the foolish urge to remove it. He did not. He knew better than to turn tenderness into trespass. Mara passed him a pair of thick gloves. "Only if we have to," she said. Caleb nodded. He did not put them on yet. The bobcat watched the gloves with immediate hatred. Her short tail thumped the dirt once. Caleb looked at Mara. Mara looked at the bobcat. Neither of them laughed, but something warm and human moved between them anyway. The animal was exhausted, smoke-stained, and cornered. Yet she still had room in her spirit to object to ugly gloves. Caleb set the gloves beside his knee, where she could inspect them from a distance. "No one admires them," he whispered. The bobcat narrowed her amber eyes. Mara eased a collapsible carrier open several feet away and laid a towel inside. It was an old brown towel from the clinic, threadbare at one corner, smelling faintly of cedar shavings and antiseptic. She poured a little water into a shallow cap and nudged it forward with a stick, stopping well short of the roots. The bobcat did not move. Her nose twitched. Then, after a long while, she extended her neck and sniffed the air above the water. Not enough to drink. Enough to say she had noticed. Caleb stayed where he was, one knee numbing in the soot. He thought of all the times he had told visitors not to crowd wild animals. Give them space. Let them choose the next inch. Do not confuse your fear for urgency or your pity for wisdom. The words had always sounded clean when he said them beside a trailhead sign or a ranger truck. They felt harder here, with a living creature breathing shallowly beneath burned roots. He wanted to help quickly. He knew quick help could ruin everything. So he waited. Mara watched the bobcat, then Caleb. She may have smoke irritation. Paw could be singed or strained. Maybe both. But she is alert. Can we draw her out? Maybe. If she decides leaving is better than staying. Caleb almost smiled. Sounds like every bobcat Mo've met. Then be charming. Mo've been told Mo't met better with trail maps. Mara's mouth curved, brief and tired. That was the second warmth of that hour. Two people speaking softly in a burned forest, pretending humor was not partly a way to keep from breaking. The third came, when Caleb reached for his water bottle and the bobcat, despite everything, leaned forward just far enough to glare at the crinkle of plastic, as if he had personally insulted her ancestors. "All right," he whispered, setting it down. No crinkling. Mara shook her head. She's training you already. The bobcat did not come out for the water. She did not come out for the shadowed carrier, or the quiet voices, or the first cooler breath of evening. But she did begin to look beyond Caleb, past his shoulder, toward the open slope. Her ears lifted, then flattened again. Her body remembered escape even when her strength did not. Caleb saw that and understood something important about her. She did not want comfort. She wanted a way out. He removed his fire coat slowly. The yellow fabric was stained capite had soot and sweat, heavy enough to shield his arms if she struck, familiar enough to carry the smell of smoke rather than clinic walls. He folded it across his forearms and settled lower, making himself smaller. Mara did not stop him. "Only if she moves toward you," she said. Caleb nodded. For several breaths, nothing happened. Then the bobcat shifted. Her injured paw touched the dirt, and she pulled it back at once. Her eyes squeezed half-closed, not with tameness, not with surrender, but with the private calculation of a wild creature measuring pain against survival. She pushed forward another in. Caleb did not reach. The hollow held all three of them in a silence, so careful it seemed the forest itself was listening. At last, the young bobcat dragged herself just far enough that the fire coat brushed her chest. Caleb lowered his voice until even Mara could barely hear him. "There you are." The bobcat's amber eyes lifted to his, fierce, frightened, and alive. And that was the first time Caleb saw her fully, not as a shape under roots, not as a wounded animal to be removed from a burn zone, but as someone who had endured the fire and still refused to disappear. The first lift was a negotiation with fear. Caleb waited until the bobcat's chest touched the folded fire coat, then slid his hands beneath the fabric instead of beneath her body. Even through the heavy cloth, he felt how light she was. She should have been muscle and spring, but she felt like heat, bones, and stubborn breath. The moment her weight shifted, she struck. Not wildly, not blindly. One paw flashed from the coat and caught the edge of his sleeve, snagging yellow fabric with small, curved claws. Caleb froze. Mara did too. The bobcat's ears flattened until they nearly disappeared into the soot-dark fur along her head. Her mouth opened in a silent warning. Caleb did not pull away. "That's fair," he whispered. "I wouldn't trust me either." The strike had not reached skin, but it told him she still owned herself. Even weakened. Even trapped. She had not become an object to be gathered up and carried out. He adjusted the coat so the cloth blocked his hands from her view and lifted only when she stopped fighting the fabric. Ash rose around his boots as he stood. The bobcat stiffened against his arms. Her body trembled once, then held rigid, every muscle trying to become stone. Her short tail pressed hard against the coat. The burr on her whisker brushed Caleb's wrist and made him think, absurdly, of a child coming home with a leaf caught in her hair. Mara walked ahead, clearing the path. "Slow," she said. Caleb took one step. The burned hollow answered with the crunch of charcoal under his boot. The sound made the bobcat twist her head toward the trees, eyes wide, and Caleb stopped at once. He had carried injured hawks and fawns before. None had felt like this. This little wild cat carried the whole terror of the ridge in her silence. "Just one step," he breathed. Mara glanced back. "You re-whispering again." She's listening. She's judging. That small joke steadied him. They moved down from the root shelf by inches. The air cooled as they left the pocket of heat, and somewhere beyond the black timber, a creak made its thin silver sound. Caleb angled his shoulder against a low branch so it would not scrape her. When a charred twig snapped beneath Mara's boot, the bobcat buried her face deeper into the coat and made a rough, offended huff. Mara murmured, "Moat no. We don't tea like it either." At the trail, they paused beside the carrier. The bobcat saw the dark opening and gathered what strength she had to resist. Her hind legs kicked once under the coat, weak but determined. Caleb lowered himself slowly to one knee, ignoring the ache in his back. He remembered Elise teasing him for kneeling to speak to frightened dogs. "You make the whole world shorter when you re-worried," she had said. Maybe he did. He made himself smaller now. Mara set a towel over part of the carrier opening to soften the hard square shape. She placed the water cap near the back. Caleb tipped the coat, not pouring the bobcat in, not forcing her head first, but giving her a dark place and enough time to decide it was better than arms. For one long minute, the bobcat refused. Then her nose twitched at the water. She crawled forward with a low, unhappy rumble, dragging the injured paw carefully beneath her. When her front half entered the carrier, she stopped and looked back at Caleb. Not softly, not gratefully. Her amber eyes held a plain warning. "Do not think this means anything." Caleb understood. "I want ta," he whispered. She disappeared into the towel-shadowed carrier, and Mara closed the door with a gentle click. Only then did Caleb realize he had been holding his breath. The drive to Split Creek Station took 40 minutes along a road. The fire had left bruised and bare. Mara rode in the passenger seat, one hand braced near the carrier, speaking in low-nonsense syllables. Caleb drove slowly enough that Tomas, following behind in the crew truck, later said a walking elk could have passed them. The bobcat stayed silent, except when the truck crossed the cattle guard. The metal rattle startled a sharp hiss from her, and Caleb apologized before he could stop himself. Mara only shook her head, amused by how quickly the ranger had become the one taking instruction. At the station, the sky had turned violet above the ridge. The cabin windows reflected the last smoke. Caleb did not take her into the house. That line mattered. Instead, he and Mara carried the Bobcat to the old equipment shed behind the station, to a quiet corner used for temporary wildlife holds. There was a sturdy enclosure, fresh straw, a heat pad, a water bowl, and enough shadow for dignity. Mara examined what she could without pushing too far. Smoke had roughened the Bobcat's breathing. The left forepaw was tender, but not beyond hope. There were no obvious breaks. She needed fluids, rest, warmth, and distance. Especially distance. She'd go to the rehab center when she is stable, Mara said. Caleb nodded, though something in him tightened. Already, he had begun wanting a future that might not be right for her, and he disliked himself for it. The Bobcat crouched in the back of the enclosure, pupils large in the dim light. When Caleb placed a bowl inside with a long-handled hook, she ignored it completely. Then, with careful precision, she reached out and hooked a clump of straw toward herself, arranging it into a small wall between her body and the humans. Mara smiled. Interior decorating. Caleb almost laughed. Defensive architecture. The Bobcat blinked once, unimpressed. That night, Caleb sat outside the shed door on an overturned bucket with his chipped green mug cooling in his hands. He kept the lantern unlit on the porch, but for the first time in years, he looked at it more than once. Inside the shed, the Bobcat shifted in the straw with soft, secretive rustles. He had carried her out of fire. That did not mean she owed him trust. It only meant he had been given the first step, and the first step, Caleb knew, was sometimes the smallest mercy and the heaviest responsibility. Before going inside, he stood and whispered through the door, "Rest, little Ember." The name came without planning. From the shadows, the Bobcat answered with a low huff, as if she disapproved of being named, but might allow the sound to exist for one night. Morning came to Split Creek Station with a strange tenderness, as if even the burned ridge outside the windows had decided to speak softly. A pale sun pressed through smoke haze and turned the cabin walls the color of weak tea. Dew streaked through the ash on the porch rail. Caleb woke before his alarm, not because of any loud sound, but because the quiet felt different. For 3 years, the cabin had held the same silence every morning, flat and familiar. That day, the silence had a small living weight behind it, tucked in the equipment shed beyond the woodpile. He dressed without turning on the radio. The chipped green mug waited beside the stove. He filled it, burned his tongue on the first swallow, and stood by the sink, watching a gray jay hop along the fence, as if inspecting the damage. The bird tilted its head at the shed, then at Caleb, and Caleb found himself whispering, "Don T. start rumors." Doctor. Mara Voss arrived before 7 Capite had a cooler, a clipboard, and her hair pulled back in a crooked knot. Caleb met her outside the shed, where the air smelled of wet straw, old boards, smoke, an antiseptic from Mara's kit. "Any noise overnight?" she asked. "A huff around 2, Caleb said. 1 scratch at 4. Then she rearranged all the straw. "Good. Is it?" For a Bobcat, redecorating is practically a diary entry. Caleb opened the shed door slowly. Inside, the young Bobcat had built her straw wall higher, Only her notched ear and one amber eye showed above it. The water bowl had been moved 6 inches to the left. The food dish Mara had placed near the entrance was untouched, and a single clump of straw sat inside it, as if Ember had filed a formal complaint. Mara saw it and nodded. Clear feedback. Caleb felt a smile come and go. She does tea like ceramic. She may not like our taste. The Bobcat watched them without blinking. Her injured forepaw was tucked beneath her chest, but she held her head a little higher than the night before. That, Caleb told himself, was enough for now. Not recovery. Just higher. Mara prepared a small portion of food and slid it in with the long-handled tray. Ember sniffed once, turned her face away, and stared at the wall with disdain. Pride had survived the fire too. They tried a shallow steel bowl next. Ember reached out with her good paw and tipped it over. The clang made Caleb flinch harder than she did. Mara folded her arms. Not steel. Caleb looked around the shed and remembered an old tin pan hanging from a nail near the workbench. He had used it for sorting screws, then for catching drips under a leaky oil can, then for nothing at all. It was dented on one side and dull from years of use. Elise had once called it the saddest pie plate in the county. He washed it twice at the outdoor spigot until his fingers went cold. When he brought it back, Mara raised an eyebrow. Elegant. She requested rustic. Caleb slid the tin pan into the enclosure and set it farther from the door than the others, leaving her room to pretend the decision was hers. Ember did not move at first. Her whiskers angled forward. Her nose were trembled. The burr still clung to one whisker, absurdly loyal. Then she rose. The motion was slow and guarded. She kept weight off the tender paw, placed her hind feet exactly where her front feet had been, and slipped around the straw wall like a shadow that had learned caution. At the pan, she paused and looked at Caleb. He looked down at the floor. That mattered. Staring could feel like pressure. So Caleb examined a knot in the boards as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. He listened instead. A sniff. A pause. The soft sound of a first bite. Mara did not celebrate. Caleb did not move. But inside him, something unclenched. He thought of all the uneaten meals he had made after Elise died. Soup poured back into jars. Toast gone cold. The body kept living before the heart knew how to join it. Watching Ember take one careful mouthful from that dented pan, Caleb understood the small courage of hunger returning. It was not happiness. It was not healing, but it was a creature deciding for one more hour to stay. Outside, a gust moved through the pines that had not burned. Near the porch, the gray jay scolded a squirrel with unnecessary drama. Mara's boot stuck briefly in mud by the door, and when she pulled free, the sound was so rude and comic that Caleb had to press his lips together. Ember lifted her head at once, cheeks full, offended on behalf of the entire forest. "Sorry," Mara whispered. The bobcat returned to the pan. Later, after Mara checked her breathing from a distance, Caleb stayed alone in the shed. He sat on the same overturned bucket with his mug balanced on his knee. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but he held it anyway. Ember had retreated behind her straw wall, though the tin pan now sat empty, except for one stubborn fleck she had ignored. "Fine," Caleb said softly. "You can keep your standards." Her ears flicked. He began to read aloud from an old fire report, not because the words mattered, but because a steady human voice could become part of a room without demanding anything. Acres burned, wind direction, containment lines. equipment used, dry, plain sentences. Ember listened with half-closed eyes, her body still angled for escape. When Caleb turned a page, she opened one eye. He lowered the paper. For a breath, neither moved. Then the Bobcat gave him one slow blink. It was not affection, not the way people liked to imagine. It was smaller and more honest than that. Her eyes closed, opened, and returned to him without panic. A brief lowering of the guard. A tiny gap in the wall she had built from straw, fear, and smoke. Caleb felt his throat tighten. He did not speak for a long while. When he finally stood, he took the empty tin pan with care and left the shed door ajar, only long enough for a stripe of morning light to fall across the straw. Behind him, Ember made one quiet huff, less angry than before, as if the name still annoyed her, but his footsteps had become something she recognized. By the fourth day, Caleb could tell whether Ember was awake before he opened the shed door. Not by sound. She hardly made any. Bobcats carried silence the way other creatures carried scent. But the shed had begun to hold different kinds of quiet, and Caleb was learning them. There was the heavy quiet of sleep, when the straw gave one slow rustle every few minutes. There was the sharp quiet of suspicion, when even the boards seemed to wait. And there was the watching quiet, which met him every morning from behind the straw wall before his hand touched the latch. He came at the same times each day. Before sunrise, just after noon, and once when the ridge turned blue at dusk. Mara had told him routine would matter more than affection. A wild animal did not need to like a person to feel safer around predictable footsteps, so Caleb made his life predictable. He crossed the yard slowly. He tapped twice on the shed frame with one knuckle. He paused before opening the door. He never stepped inside, speaking loudly, never carried anything that clattered if he could help it, and never let the door swing free in the wind. Ember learned the pattern. At first, she retreated every time the latch lifted. By the end of the week, she remained where she was, crouched low but visible, one amber eye following the path of his boots. She trusted his feet before she trusted his hands. His hands still meant bowls, tools, bandage checks. The long hook used to pull the tin pan back through the enclosure door. His feet only arrived, stopped at the same board, and waited. Caleb found that humbling. He had spent years believing care was something one did with action. Fix the step, clear the trail, carry the injured, call the right people, file the report. But Ember taught him that sometimes the most important kindness was not moving closer. Some days, he helped her most by sitting on the overturned bucket with both hands wrapped around his chipped green mug, letting the steam fade untouched, while she decided he was not a storm. The shed smelled of straw, smoke, damp canvas, and the rich fishy scent of the salmon Mara brought in small wrapped packets. Ember liked salmon with fierce seriousness. She refused trout twice, ignored chicken as if it were beneath her, and once dragged the tin pan backward with one paw so she could eat behind her straw wall in private. Caleb pretended not to notice. "You re-subtle," he murmured. The notched ear flicked. Her forepaw improved by inches. Mara came every other day, crouched outside the enclosure, and watched Ember step. The paw had been tender and heat-sore, but there was strength in it. Ember placed it down lightly, at first, then began testing it vekepi, tehat, careful pressure. When it bothered her, she lifted it and gave the straw a quick, annoyed slap, as if the bedding had caused the trouble. Mara saw this and said, "She blames the furniture." Caleb nodded gravely. "The furniture knows what it did." Ember stared at both of them with such grave dislike that Mara had to look away to hide her smile. That was how warmth entered the shed, not all at once, but through narrow cracks. The The first crack was the old tin pan which Ember accepted and all other dishes rejected. The second was a small cedar shaving that stuck to the fur between her ears one afternoon and stayed there while she tried to look dangerous. Caleb said nothing for nearly 10 minutes. At last, when it slid down her cheek and fell into the straw, Ember looked personally betrayed by gravity. The third was the pencil. Caleb had brought his notebook into the shed to update her feeding times and paw checks. He set a short pencil stub on the floor beside the bucket. Ember watched it for half an hour without moving. Caleb forgot about it. When he reached down later, the pencil was gone. He found it at dusk inside the enclosure, tucked behind the tin pan. No tooth marks. No damage. Just stolen. For the first time in many weeks, Caleb laughed aloud inside the station yard. Ember did not like the sound. She flattened both ears and huffed. Caleb apologized, still smiling, and from then on kept his pencils in his shirt pocket, though once in a while he left a dull stub near the enclosure, as if making an offering to a tiny, suspicious forest spirit. Mara noticed on her next visit. "Bribery?" she asked. "Evidence collection," Caleb said. Ember hooked the pencil with one paw and pulled it through the bars without taking her eyes off him. Mara wrote something on her clipboard. Patient displays strong administrative instincts. The days after the fire remained unsettled outside. Crews moved along the ridge. Engines came and went. Rain threatened but did not fall. The burned hollow cooled slowly, and the air kept its ashy taste. Caleb still had work beyond the station, yet he found himself measuring each patrol by how long until the next feeding. That worried him. He knew better than to fold a wild animal into the empty places of a human life. Ember was not there to mend him. She was not Elisa's lantern returning in another shape. She was a bobcat, smoke-singed and stubborn, meant for shadowed draws and pine roots and the secret roots between rocks. If she healed well enough, the best ending might be her leaving without looking back. He told himself that every night. Then he walked to the shed anyway. At dusk, the world softened. The sky over Split Creek Ridge turned lavender behind the smoke. Crickets began again in the unburned grass near the water tank. Caleb sat with the door open and read old trail notices in a voice low enough to become part of the evening. Ember rested behind her straw wall, forepaws stretched forward now, not hidden quite so tightly. Once, while Caleb read a warning about securing food from bears, Ember rolled onto one hip and began washing her good paw with delicate, offended concentration. She drew it over her ear, paused when she reached the notch, and looked at him as if daring him to comment. He did not. He only lowered his eyes to the page and kept reading. After a while, her breathing deepened. The shed darkened around them. Caleb's coffee cooled. Beyond the opaina door, the porch lantern hung unlit, catching the last faint line of sky on its glass. Inside the enclosure, Ember slept with her stolen pencil tucked near the tin pan, her wild face turned toward the sound of his familiar, careful footsteps when he finally rose to leave. The first evening, Caleb lit the porch lantern again. He did it without deciding to. He had come back from a short patrol, with his shirt smelling of dust and his boots chalked pale with ash. The sun had dropped behind Split Creek Ridge, leaving a red seam above the black timber. Smoke still lay in the low places, but the air had cooled enough that the surviving pines gave off their clean resin scent again beneath the burn. Caleb stepped onto the porch, reached for the cabin door, and saw the brass lantern hanging from its hook. His hand paused. For 3 years, he had let it hang there as a relic, polished now and then, never lit. That evening, with the shed behind him, holding the straw rustle of a recovering bobcat, the lantern looked less like a memory and more like a tool waiting for use. He filled it, struck a match, and touched flame to wick. Warm light opened inside the glass. Across the yard, in the equipment shed, Ember thumped once against the enclosure wall. Caleb turned. At first he thought the sound was panic, but when he eased the shed door open, she was not hiding. She stood on the low wooden platform Mara had added for testing her paw, body long and balanced, notched ear forward, amber eyes fixed on the glow beyond Caleb F's shoulder. The lantern had caught her attention. She was stronger now, not healed for release, Mara kept saying, but stronger in ways that changed the room. Her left forepaw still touched down Ve Kepite hot care, yet she no longer folded herself into the back corner. She climbed, she stretched. She practiced small leaps from platform to straw, and back again, each one silent, except for the whisper of bedding beneath her pads. When she succeeded, she sat still afterward as if waiting for the world to acknowledge that she had meant to do exactly that. Caleb respected the performance. "Nicely done," he said softly. Ember washed one shoulder and ignored him. The shed had become its own small weather system of routine and watchfulness. The tin pan hung on a nail between meals. The stolen pencil stubs collected in a groove beneath the platform, though Ember pretended no knowledge of them. Mara's clipboard lived on the workbench, weighted with a smooth riverstone, because one afternoon Ember had hooked the bottom sheet through the bars and torn the corner into proud little triangles. Mara had found the pieces and said, "She's Sess editing my notes." Caleb had replied, "She disagreed with your tone." Even Mara, who had seen enough rescued wild things to keep her hopes disciplined, stayed a few extra minutes each visit now. She watched Ember place her sore paw, watched the breathing ease, watched the sharpness return to the Bobcat-S movements. Still, she reminded Caleb of the line. "She's not becoming yours," Mara said one evening. Caleb kept his eyes on Ember, who was pretending not to listen while clearly listening. "Moat no. Do you?" The question was kind, which made it harder. He looked down at his chipped green mug. Mort met trying to. That was the truth. Ember had not filled the cabin. She had not made grief vanish or turned loneliness into some tidy lesson. But she had altered the hours. Caleb no longer came home to the flat hush of rooms waiting only for him. He came home to routines that required gentleness, to a tin pan, to a stolen pencil, to a wild creature whose trust was measured not in cuddling or gratitude, but in choosing not to disappear when he entered. Some evenings, after chores, he left the shed door open, with the screen latched, and sat outside under the lantern glow. Ember would climb to the high window ledge inside the enclosure and look out over the yard, her silhouette cut clean against the dim boards. Tufted ears, pale muzzle, short tail curled close. Moths circled the lantern, tapping the glass. Crickets started in the grass beyond the woodpile. Far off, a nightjar called from the unburned slope. Ember watched everything. She watched Mrs. Bell deliver a jar of plum preserves and pretend she had not walked the long driveway just to glimpse the famous patient. The Bobcat stayed still until Mrs. Bell whispered, "Aren't you a stern little queen?" And then Ember turned her back with such perfect timing that the old woman laughed all the way to her truck. She watched Tomas repair the shed hinge and drop 3 screws into the dirt. When he found only 2, Caleb pointed silently toward the enclosure, where Ember sat with the 3rd screw between her paws, like a treasure she had legally acquired. "No," Caleb told her. Ember placed one paw over it. Tomas whispered, "Negotiations have failed." And once, on a cool violet evening, she watched a field mouse make the terrible mistake of crossing the shed threshold. Ember's whole body lowered in one smooth ripple. Her eyes sharpened, her whiskers pushed forward. She did not pounce, not with the enclosure between them, but the old wild mathematics moved through her so clearly that Caleb's breath caught. The mouse vanished behind a bucket. Ember remained frozen, then looked at Caleb as if he had arranged the disappointment. "Motluglunk speak to management," he said. She flicked her notched ear. Those moments warmed the station without softening what she was. Ember was not a pet learning household manners. She was a bobcat recovering in the orbit of human care, and every graceful stretch, every silent leap, every irritated huff reminded Caleb that the forest was still inside her. He loved that most, and feared it too, because the stronger she became, the closer she moved toward leaving. At night, he began lighting the lantern regularly. Not for Elise exactly, though her memory moved through the glow. Not for himself exactly, though the porch looked less abandoned with that warm oval of light. He lit it because the station no longer felt like a place where only absence returned at dusk. One evening, as he stood to leave the shed, Ember climbed to the window ledge and settled there, facing the lantern. The glass turned her eyes briefly the same color as flame behind brass. Caleb stood by the doorframe, listening to the creak beyond the dark yard and the faint rustle of her breath. He did not say goodnight in words. He tapped twice on the frame, the same way he did when he arrived. Ember's ear flicked once. That was enough. The first true rain came in the night and found every weak place on the ridge. It tapped through the tin roof above Caleb's bed in uneven rhythms, ran down the cabin windows in trembling lines, and woke the old porch step with a swollen groan whenever the wind pressed at the door. For weeks the sky had only threatened. Now autumn arrived all at once, cold and silver, laying the smell of wet ash over Split Creek like a damp blanket shaken across the valley. Caleb woke before dawn to the sound of Ember pacing. Not the small, restless turn of straw. Not the careful practice steps she made when her paw stiffened after sleep. This was a steady back and forth inside the shed, platform to corner, corner to door, door to straw wall, repeated with the patience of worry. He pulled on his coat and crossed the yard under the rain. The lantern had gone out during the night. Its glass was beaded with water, the brass dark in the gray morning. Caleb noticed it and felt an odd pinch beneath his ribs, as if some private agreement had been broken without anyone intending it. He tapped twice on the shed frame. Inside, Ember stopped. When he opened the door, her amber eyes met him from the high window ledge. Her body was low, her notched ear angled toward the eastern slope, and her tail tip flicked in short, tight beats. Beyond the window, the burned hollow lay hidden behind rain and timber. "Morning," Caleb whispered. Ember did not blink. The shed smelled different in wet weather. Straw, damp boards, salmon, smoke returning from old wood, and the faint mineral scent of rainwater dripping off Caleb's coat. He set the tin pan down with the long hook. Ember usually waited until he looked away before eating. That morning, she ignored it completely. Caleb did not like that. He sat on the bucket and kept his hands still. Ember climbed down from the ledge in one fluid drop, landing cleanly on all four paws. The injured forepaw had improved enough that Mara had started talking about outdoor conditioning. A larger rehab enclosure. Longer leaps. Less human presence. All the right things. All the difficult things. Ember crossed to the front of the enclosure, not close enough for touch, never that, but closer than usual. Her whiskers pushed forward. She sniffed the air around Caleb's boots, then turned sharply and paced back toward the window. "She's tracking something," Mara said later that morning, after Caleb called her up from town. Mara stood under the shed awning, Vekepite hat rain ticking from the brim of her hat. She watched Ember pace, watched the Bobcat pause at every gust, watched the way her ears sorted sounds Caleb could not hear. "Storm moving scents around?" Caleb asked. "Maybe. Maybe what else?" Mara took a moment. She never filled silence just to make it easier. Maybe she says, remembering where she came from. Caleb looked toward the ridge. The burn scar was darker under rain, less like ash now, and more like a wound that had been washed but not healed. The old hollow sat beyond the first rise, where the fire had burned hottest around a cluster of ponderosas. Ember had not seen it since Caleb carried her away in his fire coat. Or perhaps, Caleb thought, she had never stopped seeing it. That afternoon, she refused trout and accepted only a small piece of salmon. After pushing the tin pan 3 inches to the left, she drank, but not much. She spent an hour on the platform, facing east, forepaw tucked neatly beneath her, as if the body had healed faster than the mind. When thunder moved far beyond the ridge, she flattened herself so low that her spotted back almost disappeared into shadow. Caleb spoke softly from the bucket, reading an old trail closure notice for the 3rd time, because his voice had become one of the few tools he trusted. Ember listened without resting. A small warmth came when the gray jay appeared under the shed awning, puffed round against the rain, and peered through the screen. Ember's head turned Vekepite, such precise offense that the bird hopped backward. Caleb murmured, "That's Mrs. Bell's gossip agent," and the bobcat gave the tiniest chuff through her nose. Another came when Tomas stopped by with a replacement lantern wick and tracked mud across the workbench mat. Ember stared at Motfi each muddy print as if taking down evidence. Tomas whispered. Motfield judged, and Caleb, still worried, found himself smiling. The 3rd came near dusk, when Caleb discovered all 3 pencil stubs lined in a careful row beside Ember's tin pan. He could not decide whether she had organized them, accused them, or prepared to steal more. "Inventory?" he asked. Ember looked past him toward the rain. The smile faded. Over the next 2 days, the warning signs grew quietly. Ember ate, then stopped halfway and listened. She slept, then woke suddenly with both ears high. She began scraping at the straw near the back corner, not in play, not in boredom, but with the intent focus of an animal making a place, then abandoning it, then making it again. Once, Caleb found the tin pan dragged beneath the platform and covered partly with straw. Mara frowned when she saw that. "Denning behavior?" Caleb asked. "Could be stress. Could be instinct. Could be both." There were things neither of them said, that a young female bobcat might have had a territory before the fire. That fire did not only take trees, it scattered scent lines, hiding places, familiar paths, and whatever secret a wild creature had kept beneath roots and stone. That Ember's body was healing inside a human-built shed, while some part of her remained out there in the wet black timber, counting what was missing. Caleb felt the old lesson pressing on him again. Help was not keeping. Love could stand beside a door without locking it. But he was not ready. That evening, the rain thinned to mist. Caleb lit the porch lantern and watched its glow stretch across the wet yard. Ember climbed to the window ledge and stared beyond it, past the lantern, past the fence, toward the burned hollow. Her breath fogged the glass once. Then she lifted her notched ear, listened to something no human heard, and answered with one low sound from deep in her chest. It was not fear. It was not comfort. It sounded, to Caleb, like a question the forest had asked first. By the third morning after the rain, the station yard had turned soft at the edges. Mist clung low over the woodpile. Drops gathered on the porch lantern and fell one by one onto the step. Caleb kept meaning to plane smooth. The air smelled of soaked ash, cedar boards, and cold metal. Beyond the fence, Split Creek ran fuller than it had all summer, hurrying over stones, with a voice that made the valley seem awake. Caleb carried Ember's tin pan across the yard under his coat. He had warmed the salmon slightly, pretending it was practical, and not worry disguised as breakfast. He tapped twice on the shed frame. No answering rustle came. He waited. Rain ticked from the roof edge. A jay muttered from the wet pine above the pump house. Caleb tapped again, softer this time, and opened the door. The shed was empty in a way he understood before his eyes accepted it. The straw wall had been torn down. The platform stood bare. The pencil stubs lay scattered near the enclosure gate. Ember's water bowl sat upright, untouched, but the old pan she favored had been dragged to the back corner and left under a thin cover of straw. Caleb stepped inside slowly. The enclosure door hung open by the width of his hand. For a second, his mind refused the shape of it. He saw the latch first, then the small smear of mud on the metal, then the shallow scrape where claws had worried at the lower hinge. Ember had worked at it in silence, patient as frost. She had not broken it. Vekepite, had panic. She had studied it, tested it, waited until rain and darkness softened every sound. He reached for the latch. It swung loose beneath his fingers. Ember, he whispered. Nothing answered. The name sounded too large in the empty shed. Caleb stood there with the warm tin pan in one hand, feeling the heat fade through the metal. The absence of her was not quiet. It had edges. It pressed against the straw, the platform, the groove, where stolen pencils should have been hidden. He had known she might leave. He had told himself the best love would be ready for that. Yet the truth of it arriving without goodbye made him feel foolishly unprepared, like a man who had rehearsed winter and still stepped outside without a coat. On the workbench, Mara's clipboard had been knocked crooked. One corner had a fresh bite mark. Caleb stared at Motefit and gave a small, broken laugh, because Ember had apparently paused during her escape to insult the paperwork. The laugh did not last, but it kept him moving. He set the pan down, crouched, and studied the floor. There were prints in the damp dust near the shed door. Small, rounded, unmistakable. A Bobcat S-tracks. They crossed the threshold, paused beneath the awning, and turned toward the yard. Caleb followed them outside. The mud held the story in fragments. Ember had stepped around the puddle beneath the lantern instead of through it. She had climbed onto the low rail near the porch, leaving one neat print on the wet wood, then dropped down beside the broken step. At the sight of that print, Caleb almost smiled. She had avoided the step that groaned, as if she still objected to unnecessary noise. Then the tracks angled toward the old service gate. The gate had always stuck in wet weather. Caleb had tied it open the day before while hauling brush and forgotten to latch it properly afterward. Now it stood just wide enough for a slim, determined bobcat to slip through. A strand of her fur clung to the rough post, pale in the soot-gray light. Caleb touched it with one finger, then let it go. He did not curse. That would have been easier. He did not blame Mara, or the latch, or the rain, or the wild mind that had chosen the ridge over straw and tin and careful human routines. He only stood at the gate with his coat darkening under the mist, and felt the old lesson strike deeper than it ever had when he had spoken it to visitors. Help was not keeping. He had meant it when it cost him nothing. Now it cost him Ember. A small movement near the pump house made him turn. The gray jay hopped onto a fence post, puffed wet and indignant, and gave him a scolding note. Caleb looked at the bird and murmured, "Yes." Mort noticed. The jay flew off, apparently satisfied that management had been informed. That tiny exchange almost steadied him. So did the sight of Tomas' missing screw still sitting on the shed shelf where Caleb had placed it after reclaiming it from Ember. So did the pencil stubs, scattered now but still there, proof she had been more than a shadow passing through his life. Caleb radioed Mara with his thumb cold on the button. "She's gone," he said. Mara was silent for a breath too long. "When?" "Sometime last night." She opened the enclosure, went through the service gate. "Any blood? Drag marks?" "No. Tracks look steady. Left front light, but steady." "That's good," Mara said, though her voice held the same worry his chest did. "Caleb, don't chase her blindly." "Mote no. Let her track speak first." He closed his eyes. Let her track speak. It was the sort of thing Mara said because she kanoeve kept animals and because she knew him. Caleb wanted to run toward the burned hollow, calling her name, until the forest either returned her or punished him for asking. Instead, he went back into the shed, took his field pack, left the chipped green mug untouched, and lifted the porch lantern from its hook. The flame was out, but the glass still smelled faintly of smoke and oil. At the gate, he looked once at the yard. The shed door stood open behind him. The tin pan rested inside, cooling. Rain softened every print already, blurring the careful marks Ember had left. Caleb stepped through the gate and followed them toward the black timber. Not to bring her back by force. Not to claim what had never belonged to him. Only to know whether the wild creature he had carried from fire was still moving beneath the wet pines, and whether the forest that had called her home had mercy enough to let her live. The tracks held for the first 100 yards. They crossed the wet grass behind the station, slipped beneath a juniper, and climbed the first rise toward the burn. Caleb followed with the porch lantern in one hand and his field pack in the other, moving slowly enough that the mud could finish each sentence before rain blurred it away. Ember had not run. That was the first mercy. Her prints were steady, with the left forepaw touching softer than the others, but touching all the same. She had paused beneath brush, then at Split Creek, where the stones were slick and black with rain. There, Caleb found a smear of ash on a rock where her flank must have brushed it. He rested, his fingers near the mark, without touching it. The creek smelled of wet leaves and cold earth. Downstream, a branch knocked against a boulder, hollow as a distant door. Mara caught up beyond the crossing, medical bag at her side. Behind her came Josie Hale, a 19-year-old wildlife volunteer from town who helped Mara during fawn season and spoke to frightened animals with the quiet of someone entering a church. Josie held up flagging tape. Maud brought orange and blue. The orange looked too cheerful. Caleb looked at the blue tape, then at the burned ridge. Blue S better. Mara glanced at him. How old? Few hours. Less before the rain started. Then we follow until we can tee. If Ember had gone too far, the rain would erase her. If she had climbed rock, they might lose her. If she had hidden, she would not answer, because Caleb had given her a name in a shed. A bobcat could become bark, shadow, and silence while people walked past. They moved through black timber. The fire had changed the forest into a place familiar only in outline. Caleb knew the slope, the draw, the crooked half-fallen snag, but everything had lost its softness. Ferns were flattened. The soil was dark and slick. Charred trunks stood in rows. He kept his eyes on the ground. He had work to do. At each clear print, Josie tied a small blue strip to a branch. Once, she slipped in the mud and landed sitting, with such a startled expression that Mara asked whether her dignity needed bandaging. Josie, cheeks red, replied that it had suffered a minor sprain. Caleb smiled despite himself. They found where Ember had sheltered beneath a burned log. The ash there was pressed smooth in the shape of her body. A few pale hairs clung to the underside of bark. Beside the hollowed place lay one of Caleb's pencil stubs. He stared at it. It was the shortest one, rubbed dark by travel. Ember must have carried it from the shed, then dropped it there, as if leaving behind the smallest piece of the strange human room she had escaped. Josie whispered. She packed supplies. Mara gave her a warning look, but Caleb's mouth softened. She was always practical, he said. He placed the pencil in his shirt pocket. The little weight of it hurt more than it should have. Farther upslope, the tracks grew harder to read. Rain filled the shallow prints. Mud gave way to damp needles, then to stone where even Ember's careful feet left nothing. Caleb searched the soft patches and the lee side of fallen limbs. He found one print near bunchgrass, then none for 30 yards. The hollow waited ahead. The place where he had first found her looked smaller in daylight and worse in rain. The root shelf had collapsed further. The old pocket beneath the ponderosa roots, the place that had held Ember's breathing, was empty except for water and ash. Caleb knelt beside it. For a moment, the world narrowed to the drip from the burned roots. He saw her again as she had been that first evening, amber eyes in darkness, notched ear flattened, burr trembling on her whisker. He remembered the weight of her in the fire coat. He remembered whispering because she was listening. Now he whispered because she was gone. Ember. The hollow gave back only rain. Mara stood behind him, but did not touch his shoulder. Josie moved away and pretended to study a snag, so Caleb could have his face unseen. That small kindness nearly undid him. He pressed the lantern into the mud beside his knee. It was useless by day, unlit and wet, but he had carried it anyway. Elise's lantern had once meant someone was expected home. Caleb had brought it into the burn because some part of him wanted Ember to see a light and understand that one place in the valley had not closed against her. But bobcats did not read lanterns as invitations. They read wind, cover, hunger, threat, old scent. Hidden calls from places humans could not name. Mara circled the hollow slowly. Caleb. He looked up. She pointed to the far side of the root shelf. At first he saw nothing. Then the pattern formed. A print. Another. Ember had come to the hollow and left again. Not downhill toward the station, but across the slope, deeper into burned timber. Not wandering. Choosing. Caleb stood too quickly. She went on. She did, Mara said. But we re-losing light. We can keep going. We can for another half hour. Not beyond that. The practical truth struck like cold water. Caleb looked at the darkening ridge, at the rain-softening Ember-S trail, at the blue tape fluttering behind them like small pieces of hope tied to dead branches. He wanted to argue. Instead, he nodded once. They searched until the prints vanished on rock. No cry came. No flash of spotted fur. No notched ear turned among the shadows. Only rain, ash, and the slow closing of day. When they turned back, Caleb left the lantern beside the hollow, tucked under the half-fallen root where water could not fill it. Mara noticed but said nothing. Josie tied one last blue strip above it. At the station, the shed waited with its empty platform, scattered straw, and tin pan untouched in the corner. Caleb washed the mud from his hands and found ash under every nail. That night, he did not light the porch. He sat on the overturned bucket inside the shed, holding the pencil stub Ember had carried into the burn, and listened to the rain tapping the roof where her breathing used to be. For the first time since the fire, Split Creek Station felt empty again. Only now, it remembered what it had lost. For 2 days after the search, Caleb kept finding himself listening for a sound that was not there. He heard it in branches scraping the shed roof, in the loose porch step when wind shifted, in the kettle's click before boiling. Each time, his body turned before his mind could correct it. No straw rustled. No offended huff answered from the enclosure. Only the empty shed waited behind the station, swept clean now but not restored. Caleb had picked up the scattered pencil stubs, washed the tin pan, and hung it back on its nail. He had told himself those were chores. Mara had seen the careful way he did them and said nothing. On the second evening, the rain finally stopped. The valley held the smell of wet ash and opened earth. Clouds broke low over the ridge, and the last light came through in thin gold bands that caught on every water drop clinging to the fence wire. Caleb stood on the porch with Elise's lantern in his hand, thumb resting against the cool brass. He had meant to take it back to the hollow and see whether the flame would stay lit through the mist. Then the gray jay screamed from the pump house. Not scolded. Screamed. Caleb lifted his head. At the edge of the service gate, something moved like a piece of dusk loosening from the grass. Ember stood there. For one breath, Caleb did not trust his eyes. She was thinner, her flanks tucked, her pale muzzle smudged with mud. A dark burr clung near the same whisker as before, or perhaps another burr had found the place by tradition. Her notched ear stood sharp against the wet light. Her left forepaw touched the ground lightly, but she was upright, steady, watching him as if he were late. The lantern nearly slipped from his hand. "Ember," he whispered. She did not come closer. Of course she did not. She was still herself, just outside the yard, forest at her back and station before her, choosing neither fully. Her short tail flicked once. Then she turned and took 3 steps toward the trees. Caleb understood, only because he had learned not to rush her. He set the lantern on the porch rail and reached for his coat. The gray jay hopped to the fence and shook rain from its feathers with the pride of a town crier. Caleb muttered, "You'll want credit for this later," and the bird gave a sharp note that sounded very much like agreement. That small foolishness kept his hands steady. He radioed Mara ve Kepitehat, his eyes still on the gate. She S back. Mara's answer came through a crackle. At the shed? At the tree line. She S moving. Don T crowd her. I won T. And Caleb? He paused. Bring light. He took the lantern. Ember waited beneath a juniper while he crossed the yard, not patiently. She waited with the stern endurance of a wild creature, annoyed that humans required time to understand simple instructions. When he reached the gate, she slipped ahead, silent over mud, stopping only when he fell too far behind. The blue strips Josie had tied still fluttered in the damp timber. Ember ignored them. She chose a different path, lower than the one they had followed, weaving through salal. Around burned trunks, beneath a fallen branch, Caleb had to duck under with far less grace than she had. Once, his boot sank ankle-deep in mud. The sound was rude and wet. Ember looked back over one shoulder, eyes flat with judgment. "Mokano ove kep," he whispered. "My form is poor." She turned away, apparently satisfied by his confession. The lantern glow trembled across black bark and wet ferns. Night gathered in the hollows first. The forest smelled of cold water, char, bruised needles, and something musky Caleb could not name, but Ember followed without hesitation. She moved like an animal with a map written under her skin. Not wandering. Leading. That word frightened him. He had spent 2 days fearing the wild had called her away. Now he understood, with a slow tightening in his chest, that she had not come back to be saved again. She had come back because something out there mattered more than her fear of him. Love, Caleb thought, was not always a creature returning to your door. Sometimes it was a creature asking you to leave the door behind. They reached a shallow draw below the old hollow. Caleb had passed near it during the search and seen nothing. Now Ember slipped beneath a fallen pine whose roots had lifted a curtain of damp earth. She stopped at the entrance to a small pocket under the trunk and looked back. Not with softness, with insistence. Caleb lowered himself to one knee. The mud soaked through his pant leg. He set the lantern down carefully, shielding the flame with one hand. Its light spread under the root curtain in a low amber pool. A smell rose from the hollow, warm and animal, hidden beneath ash and wet bark. Ember stepped between Caleb and the opening. Her body lowered, shoulders tense, not threatening him exactly, but drawing a line he understood. Her whiskers pushed forward. Her ears sorted the dark. Then, from under the fallen pine, came the faintest sound. A tiny rasp. Then another. Caleb went still. The whole burned ridge seemed to lean close around him. He did not reach in. He did not move the roots. He did not speak loudly. He only looked at Ember, at the soot on her muzzle, the weariness in her flanks, the fierce steadiness that had brought her back through rain and ash to fetch the one human she had decided might help without taking. His throat closed. The word that left him was barely a breath. Ember. She blinked once, slow and exhausted. This time, Caleb understood it was not a doorway opening for him. It was a warning, a request, and a trust so fragile he hardly dared breathe near it. Behind them, far down at Split Creek Station, the porch stood dark. But in the draw beneath the fallen pine, Elise S. lantern burned low against the wet earth, and Caleb Rowe knelt beside a wild bobcat who had carried a secret through fire. Caleb did not touch the hollow until Mara arrived. That was the first promise he kept. He stayed kneeling in the wet draw, with the lantern between his boots and the fallen pine, letting its small amber light rest against the root curtain without pushing into the darkness. Ember stood a few feet away, her body angled across the opening, a thin, fierce shape between him and whatever breathed inside. The sounds came only now and then. Tiny rasps, soft shifts, a fragile rustle beneath roots and damp needles. Caleb held himself so still that his knee began to ache. Rainwater slid from the brim of his hat and dropped onto his sleeve. The draw smelled of vacapite bark, ash, cold mud, and the unmistakable warm musk of hidden animal life. Somewhere above, a loosened branch creaked in the wind. Ember watched him watching. Her notched ear twitched toward every sound. Her whiskers pushed forward, then flattened. Once, she stepped to the hollow entrance and lowered her head, not going inside, only breathing into the darkness with a low murmur that barely counted as sound. The rustling settled. Caleb looked away. It felt private. When Mara arrived, she came without her truck lights, walking the last stretch with Josie behind her and a covered basket in one hand. Josie's boots slipped twice on the wet slope, but she did not complain. She only whispered, "Mort am being very graceful inside," and Caleb, despite the tightness in his chest, almost smiled. Mara stopped beside him, read the scene without a question, and lowered herself slowly. "How many sounds?" she whispered. "More than one," Caleb said. Ember's head snapped toward Mara. Mara froze at once. "All right," she murmured. "Mort hear you." The bobcat did not move closer, but she did not run. That alone told Caleb how much the night had asked of her. Ember had left safety, crossed rain-swollen ground, returned to the station, and led him back through the dark. Now she stood swaying slightly, all her strength spent on guarding. Mara saw it too. "She needs rest," she whispered. "She won tea, leave them." "No. She won tea." That word, them, hung in the draw like breath on cold glass. Caleb did not repeat it. Mara opened the basket and took out warmed cloths, a small packet of food, and a shallow collapsible dish. She moved as if the forest had become a room where someone was sleeping. She placed the dish well away from the hollow, then backed off. Caleb filled it from his canteen and set a piece of salmon beside it, on a flat stone. Ember looked at the offering with suspicion. Then she looked at Caleb. He lowered his eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the bobcat stepped forward, took the salmon in her teeth, and carried it not into the hollow, but behind a clump of burned fern, where she could eat while still watching the entrance. Even exhausted, She refused to be predictable. Mara whispered, "She has rules." Caleb whispered back, "Many." Josie, crouched behind them, opened her notebook and immediately lost her pencil in the mud. When she found it stuck to her sleeve, Ember paused mid-bite and stared as if judging the entire profession of wildlife care. Josie mouthed a silent apology. That small, ridiculous moment warmed the cold draw more than the lantern did. They worked slowly. Not on the hidden little lives. Not yet. Not unless there was distress. Mara explained in fragments softly that the best help might be to secure the area, watch from a distance, support Ember's strength, and avoid turning a fragile den into a human emergency. Caleb knew those rules. He had taught versions of them to campers and school groups, and worried callers from town. But knowing them beside a signboard was different from obeying them, while tiny breaths moved beneath burned roots. He wanted to fix everything. The urge rose in him like grief had once risen beside Elisa's hospital bed, when he had wanted to bargain with machines, doctors, weather, God, anything that would listen. He had learned then that love could exhaust itself trying to control what it could only accompany. Now, in the wet ashes of the ridge, Ember was teaching him the same lesson in another language. Do not take. Do not rush. Stay useful. So Caleb stayed useful. He and Josie marked a wide, quiet boundary with blue tape far from the den. Mara checked Ember from a distance and decided she was worn thin but not failing. Caleb carried a second tin pan from his pack, the old dented one from the shed, because he had brought it without thinking. When he set it near the flat stone, Ember abandoned the collapsible dish at once and dragged the tin pan 2 feet farther into shadow. Mara saw this and whispered, "Of course." Caleb's mouth softened. She has brand loyalty. Ember, who had no patience for commerce, drank from the pan only after turning her back on all 3 humans. Near midnight, the wind eased. The clouds opened enough for a few stars to show above the black pines. Caleb placed Elisa's lantern beneath a shelf of roots where its light could not shine directly into the den. It made a low glow across the mud, just enough for Mara to see Ember's outline when she moved. At last, Ember stepped into the hollow. Only halfway. She vanished from the shoulders forward, leaving her haunches and short tail visible beneath the fallen pine. The hidden rustling quieted. A tiny sound rose, then tucked itself away. Caleb turned his face toward the dark trees and breathed through the ache in his throat. Mara put one hand lightly on his sleeve, then let go. No speech. No lesson. Just enough contact to say she understood. Before dawn, they withdrew to a watching distance. Caleb left the tin pan, a little food, and the lantern unlit now, its brass dark but familiar near the roots. Ember remained at the den mouth, eyes half closed, still guarding, still wild. As Caleb stepped back through wet ash, she opened one amber eye. Not softened, not tame, but steady. He tapped twice on the nearest pine trunk, the same small rhythm he used at the shed door. Her notched ear flicked. That was all she gave him. It was enough to carry home. By morning, the ridge had washed itself into color. Not green yet, not healed, but less black than it had seemed by lantern light. The rain had settled the ash into the soil, leaving the fallen pine dark and slick. Its lifted roots combed Vekepi hot needles. Mist hung low in the draw, and sounds arrived softened. The creek below, the drip from root tips, Ember's faint movement inside the hidden pocket. Caleb returned with Mara just after sunrise. Josie came behind them carrying a small insulated bag against her chest, as carefully as if it held glass. She had written quiet on the side in blue marker, then added beneath it, very quiet. Mara saw Caleb notice and gave him a look that said not to encourage her. He encouraged her anyway, with the smallest smile. Ember was at the den mouth when they arrived. She looked rough in the pale light, leaner than Caleb liked, her fur ridged from rain and sleep, her notched ear dark at the tip. Yet there was a steadiness in her that had not been there in the shed. Tired, yes. Guarded, always. But placed. She was no longer pacing toward some invisible ache. She had reached it. Mara crouched first, several yards away. "Good morning, Ember," she said softly. Ember blinked once, not a greeting so much as a decision not to leave. From beneath the fallen pine came a tiny sound, thinner than bird song. Caleb felt it move through him. He had heard newborn animals before in barns and rehab rooms, little calls that made practical people lower their voices. But these sounds carried something different because they came from the center of the burn. Fire had roared over this place. Rain had chilled it. Ash had buried familiar scent. And still, under the roots of a fallen tree, life had remained stubborn enough to breathe. Mara waited nearly an hour before doing more than watch. That was her gift. She could make patience feel like action. She studied Ember's movements, the angle of her head, how often she entered the hollow, whether she settled when the small sounds rose. Caleb stood farther back, with his hands in his coat pockets, resisting every human impulse to kneel too close. At last, Mara whispered, "Moit need one look. Only if she allows it." Caleb nodded, though the decision was not his. Mara moved by inches, not toward Ember but toward the side opening where the lifted roots left a narrow view into the pocket. Ember rose immediately. Her body lowered. Her whiskers pushed forward, and one paw pressed into the mud with silent warning. Mara stopped. For several breaths, no one moved. Then Caleb tapped twice, not on the trunk this time, but gently against the lantern hanging from his hand. The sound was soft, familiar, almost swallowed by mist. Ember's notched ear turned. She looked at him. He lowered his eyes, the way he had in the shed when she first ate from the tin pan. He did not ask her to trust Mara. He only reminded her that humans could stand still. Ember held the line for one long moment, then stepped aside just enough. Not permission. A narrow mercy. Mara lowered herself and looked into the root pocket. Her face changed, not dramatically, not with surprise made large, but with the tender restraint of someone seeing something too fragile for loud emotion. "Two," she whispered. Caleb closed his eyes. "Two." The word entered him like warmth. "They re-alive?" he asked, barely speaking. "They re-alive." Josie pressed both hands over her mouth, and her eyes shone. She did not squeal, though Caleb could tell the effort cost her dearly. Instead, she looked at Ember and whispered, "Good job, Mama," so softly that even the mist seemed to keep it secret. Ember did not care for praise. She stepped back to the entrance and gave Josie a flat stare that suggested compliments were inefficient. Josie nodded at once, chastened. Understood. That was the first warmth of the morning. The second came when Mara, still crouched, described what she saw in quiet pieces. Two kits tucked deep in dry needles, small as folded mittens, their fur smoky gray kepite, hot faint spots already beginning to show. One had a pale chin like Ember. The other had a tiny dark smudge over one eye that made it look permanently skeptical. Caleb thought that one might belong to Ember's opinionated side. The third warmth came when the gray jay arrived, landed above the den, and announced itself with tremendous importance. Ember's head snapped upward. Caleb whispered, "Not now," as if the bird were an unruly neighbor at a cradle. The jay, perhaps recognizing authority, flew off with an offended flick of wings. Mara's mouth trembled around a smile. The care plan became smaller than Caleb expected, and harder because of it. They would not take the kits unless they had to. Mara saw no immediate sign that demanded it. Ember was nursing, alert and able to move. The den was hidden, partly dry, and difficult for larger predators to enter. What they could do was create space around it, keep people away from the burn pocket, leave supplemental food at a distance for Ember, and monitor from far enough back that the family did not become dependent or exposed. Caleb listened and felt the strange ache of rightness. A part of him wanted to carry them all to warmth, to straw, to the shed, where he understood the walls. But the shed had been safety for one chapter, not the whole story. Ember had not returned to ask for a cage. She had returned to ask for a chance. He looked at the fallen pine and remembered Elisa's lantern on snowy nights, how it had never dragged him home, but simply showed that home was possible. Maybe that was all he was allowed to be now, a light at the edge. Food placed far enough away, a gate left quiet, a person who did not mistake being needed for being owned. Ember slipped into the den and disappeared almost fully. The tiny sounds softened. Caleb set the dented tin pan on a flat stone well away from the roots, filled it, and stepped back. Ember's eyes watched from the darkness, 2 amber points above the hidden kits. He tapped twice against the pine. This time, from inside the den, she answered with one low huff. It was not gratitude. It was Ember. And it made Caleb smile all the way back down the ridge. The boundary around the den became the quietest place in Split Creek. Caleb marked it, Vekeptahat blue tape tied far back from the fallen pine, not close enough to draw attention, and not so far that wandering hikers would miss the warning. He posted a temporary closure on the lower trail, plain and official, with no mention of bobcats, fire recovery area, unstable trees. Please keep out. It was all true, and it protected Ember better than any tender explanation would have. People listened to danger more reliably than wonder. In the mornings, he walked the outer line with his coffee steaming from the chipped green mug, checking for boot prints, tire marks, loose tape, and curious neighbors who had heard enough rumors to become a problem. The burn smelled different each week. At first it had been wet ash and char. Then came the darker smell of turned soil. After that, faint and almost shy, the smell of green things beginning under black ground. Ember remained mostly unseen. That was good, Mara kept reminding him. It still hurt a little. Caleb caught only pieces of her life now. A track pressed beside the flat stone where the tin pan waited. A pale hair snagged on a low branch. The pan moved 6 feet overnight, sometimes hidden under fern, sometimes turned upside down, once left perfectly centered on a stump, as if Ember had finished Vekepite hat human housekeeping and wanted the matter closed. She is redecorating the forest now, Josie said. Caleb nodded. The forest should prepare itself. Mara made him reduce the feeding slowly. Supplemental food was help, not a habit. Ember needed strength, but the kits needed a mother who hunted, listened, ranged, and chose cover by her own knowing. so Caleb carried less each week and placed it farther from the den, always at irregular times, always leaving before Ember arrived. He missed the shed routine more than he admitted. He missed the straw rustle, the offended huff, the pencil thefts, the way Ember had once made the empty station feel inhabited. But when he stood at the boundary and heard, far inside the closed area, the small coughing chirp of one kit and Ember's low answer, he understood why distance had become the new form of love. One evening, after a warm wind had dried the upper slope, Caleb saw the kits for the first time. He had gone to retrieve the tin pan before dusk, expecting it empty and hidden. Instead, he stopped behind a burned cedar and saw movement beneath the fallen pine. Ember emerged first, low and fluid, her notched ear bright against the shadow. She scanned the draw with the seriousness of a creature who trusted nothing completely, then stepped aside. Two small shapes tumbled after her. Caleb forgot to breathe. They were not graceful yet. Their paws looked too large for their bodies, and their short tails jerked ve-kep, ite, hat every uncertain step. The pale-chinned kit followed Ember closely, sniffing the exact places she sniffed, placing each paw where hers had been. The skeptical one with the dark smudge over one eye pounced sideways at a curled leaf, missed it, and then sat down as if the leaf had behaved dishonorably. Caleb pressed his lips together. Laughter would have been trespass, even gentle laughter. But warmth moved through him so suddenly that his eyes stung. Ember turned her head. For one heartbeat, she looked straight toward the cedar where he stood, hidden. Caleb did not move. He knew she knew. She had probably known before he arrived. Her amber eyes held him, not angry, not welcoming, simply measuring. Then she looked away. The permission in that was smaller than a whisper and larger than anything he could have asked for. The kits learned the edge of the world in fragments. They batted at pine needles. They startled at mote fee beetles. They climbed halfway over a root and then back down with great private drama. Ember watched them with patient severity. When the skeptical one tried to wander toward the open draw, she crossed the distance without sound and blocked him with her body. No fuss, no panic, just a wall of spotted fur and decision. Caleb thought of Elise then, not with the sharp ache that used to empty rooms, but with a soft pull of memory. She had loved children in libraries because they believed every shelf led somewhere. She would have stood beside him without speaking and understood why silence was the only respectful language. He returned to the station after dark. The porch lantern was lit. Moths tapped at the glass. Tomas had left a small paper bag on the step with 3 new pencils inside and a note that read, "For office supplies lost to wildlife." Caleb laughed alone on the porch, quietly enough not to disturb the night. The next morning, he left one dull pencil stub on the workbench in the empty shed, not as bait, not as grief, just as a harmless little memorial to a time when Ember had edited all human plans. Mrs. Bell came by later, with biscuits wrapped in a towel, and asked whether the ridge was growing back. Slowly, Caleb said. That's usually how the stubborn things do it. He looked toward the black pines and knew she was right. By late autumn, the kits had begun following Ember beyond the den draw. Caleb saw their tracks near Split Creek, tiny versions of hers, pressed around stones where water spoke over the gravel. He saw where they had practiced scratching a fallen log, leaving crooked marks beside Ember's clean, high ones. Once, Josie found the tin pan with 2 little muddy prints inside it. "She's teaching them terrible table manners," Josie whispered. Mara replied, "They re-advance students." Caleb smiled, but he also felt the ending approaching. Not the end of care, the end of nearness. On the last evening before the trail reopened in winter, he walked the boundary one more time. Frost silvered the blue tape. The air held the clean bite of coming cold. Far up the slope, Ember stood on a rock with both kits below her, 3 shapes in the dimming forest. She looked larger there, restored to her own country, her notched ear cut sharp against the fading sky. Caleb tapped twice on the trunk beside him. Ember's ear flicked. Then she turned and led her kits into the pines, teaching them the old paths through a forest that was learning how to live again. Winter did not arrive at Split Creek all at once. It came first as frost on the service gate, then as thin ice along the shaded bends of the creek, then as quiet mornings when Caleb's breath showed white, while he crossed the yard with the chipped green mug cupped between both hands. The burned ridge changed under the cold. Black trunks stood clean against pale skies, ash hardened beneath a crust of frozen needles. In the hollow places, where rainwater had gathered and sunk, tiny blades of new grass waited under frost as if keeping their own secrets. Ember did not return to the shed. Caleb had not expected her to, not truly, but expectation did not erase listening. For a while, every night sound still reached into him. A fox barking beyond the pump house, the gray jay landing too heavily on the roof, the porch step groaning under the weight of wind. His body would pause before his mind remembered that the enclosure was empty, the straw removed, the tin pan washed and stored on its nail. He left the shed door closed now. Not locked, just closed. There was a difference. Mara visited once a week through early winter, partly to check fire recovery, partly to make sure Caleb was eating something besides coffee and canned soup. She never said the second part. She simply arrived with field notes, a bag of oranges, and practical reasons to sit at his table for 10 minutes. One afternoon, as snow threatened but did not fall, she found him repairing the enclosure latch. "Expecting another escape artist?" she asked. Caleb tightened a screw. "No." "Then why fix it?" He looked at the latch, then toward the ridge. "Because things should be ready, without needing to be used." Mara nodded as if that answer belonged in a medical chart, under a heading she had no intention of naming. The winter sightings were rare and distant. In December, Josie found 3 sets of tracks crossing the old trail above Split Creek, one sure and wide, 2 smaller, uneven but improving. She sent a message that said only, "They still writing." Caleb read it twice and saved it, though he pretended to be above sentimental messages from 19-year-old volunteers. In January, Tomas saw a bobcat on the ridge at dawn while clearing a storm-fallen branch. Not close. Not long. A lean shape with a notched ear, standing above 2 smaller shadows before all 3 slipped behind snow-dusted manzanita. Tomas told Caleb she had looked offended by the weather. "That sounds like her," Caleb said. Mrs. Bell heard about it by supper, because Mrs. Bell heard about everything by supper. The next day she left a jar of blackberry jam on Caleb's porch with a note that read, "For anyone raising children in the cold." Caleb knew she meant him as much as Ember. He spread the jam on toast that evening and laughed when the first bite dripped onto his sleeve. The cabin had changed by then, in ways no visitor would notice at first. The second spoon no longer appeared beside the stove every morning. Not because Caleb had forgotten Elise, but because remembering had become less tied to repeating pain. He lit the porch lantern most evenings, and its glow no longer accused the dark. Sometimes he spoke to Elise while trimming the wick. Sometimes he did not need to. Her presence had softened from absence into weather, something unseen, but part of the way light moved through the rooms. On the first clear morning after a hard freeze, Caleb walked alone to the burned hollow. He carried no food, no carrier, no medical bag. Only the lantern and the dull pencil stub ember had dropped beneath the burned log. The path had become familiar again, though the forest itself was altered. Snow lay in narrow lines along fallen trunks. The blue tape had been removed after the closure lifted, but Caleb still no eve kept where each strip had fluttered. The den beneath the fallen pine was empty. Dry needles had blown into the entrance. A rabbit had left tracks nearby, bold with the confidence of no recent bobcat. Caleb crouched beside the hollow where he had first found Ember. The root shelf had collapsed almost completely. A small fern, impossible and green, had pushed up beside the blackened wood. Its curled tip trembled in the cold wind. He set the lantern near it. For a long while, he listened. No tiny rasps came from under roots. No straw rustled. No wild mother stepped from shadow to judge his boots. Only the creek below, the wind in surviving pines, and the far knock of a woodpecker testing a dead trunk. Caleb took the pencil stub from his pocket. He turned it once in his fingers, remembering how Ember had stolen it without damaging it, carried it into the burn, and left it where grief could find both hurt and humor. He did not leave it in the hollow. It did not belong to the forest. It belonged to the story of the shed, the tin pan, the night of the lantern, and the bobcat who had taught him that trust did not always move closer. He slipped it back into his pocket. Then, from the ridge above, came a faint sound. Not a cry, not a call meant for him. A low, rough huff carried by cold air and nearly lost among the trees. Caleb looked up. On a ledge between two dark pines stood Ember. She was far enough away that he might have mistaken her for Shadow, if not for the notched ear, the pale muzzle, and the stillness that had always seemed more deliberate than rest. Below her, two young bobcats moved through the brush, larger now, quick and awkward, learning the slope in leaps and pauses. The one with the smudged eye batted at a snow clump. The pale-chinned one followed Ember's track exactly. Caleb did not raise a hand. He did not step forward. He only tapped twice on the lantern glass. Across the distance, Ember's notched ear flicked. Then she turned, gathered her kits with a glance, and vanished into the pines. Caleb stayed kneeling beside the green fern and the burned root shelf, his breath pale in the morning air. The whisper left him before he knew he had made it. Go well, little Ember. And for the first time in years, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt like something alive had chosen to keep moving. Now the camera pulled back from Split Creek, from the blackened hollow where the fern kept its small green promise, from the porch where the lantern burned with a steadier light than it once had. The shed behind the station stayed swept and quiet, but it was no longer a room of loss. It had held fear, patience, salmon in a dented tin pan, stolen pencil stubs, and the slow language of footsteps becoming familiar. Some evenings, Caleb still heard the loose step groan under his boot and smiled, instead of sighing. He still drank from the chipped green mug. He still watched the ridge at dusk, not because he expected Ember to return, but because loving a wild thing had taught him to honor the places it chose. Ember and her kits belonged to the pines, to cold creek stones, to hidden trails no human map could hold. Yet a little of her remained at the station, in the repaired latch, in the lantern glow, in the way Caleb lowered his voice whenever the forest grew still. And perhaps that was enough. Some rescues did not end with keeping. Some ended with an open gate, a quiet boundary, and a whisper sent after paw prints fading into frost. Thank you for staying beside this story until the last light softened. Wherever you are listening from tonight, may the memory of the animal that changed your heart come gently, like lantern light through trees. Rest easy now. The ridge is quiet. The fern is green. Somewhere beyond the dark pines, a notched ear turns toward the wind, and then the forest settles into silence. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.